Welcome to another episode of Tank Talks, your personal think tank for all things startups and venture capital. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, founder and managing partner at Ripple Ventures. On today's show, we welcome Michelle Delcambre, operating partner and talent advisor for Felicis Ventures, to discuss navigating the current talent markets as a startup founder. Michelle shares her incredible background working at some of the fastest growing tech companies like Zenefits, Atlassian, Okta, and Stripe as a recruiting leader and the lessons she learned from those roles and experiences. We asked Michelle to share her current views on the markets for recruiters and how founders can stay on the winning side in the war for talent these days. We dig into the role diversity and inclusion play for so many companies these days, and what sorts of actions companies are taking to attract and retain talent using diversity as their advantage. Finally, we asked Michelle to explain how a company can develop a strategic talent pipeline and the competitive advantages it can bring to your recruiting process. But before we get started today, as our listeners probably know by now, the team at Ripple is always focused on helping our founders and portfolio companies find the best partners to work with. And when it comes to corporate finance and cash management, there's nobody we recommend more than the team at Jeeves. At Ripple, we manage all our fund expenses and employee credit cards using Jeeves. The team at Jeeves helped me get my team set up with physical and virtual cards in days. I was able to allow my teammates to expense items in multiple currencies, allowing them to pay for anything, anywhere, at any time. We weren't asked for any personal guarantees or to pay any setup or monthly SaaS fees. Not only does Jeeves save us time, but they also give us up to 3% cash back on our purchases, including expenses like Google, Facebook, or AWS every month. The best part is Jeeves puts up the cash and you settle once every 30 days in any currency you want, unlike some other corporate card companies that make you prepay every month. Listeners of Tank Talks can get set up today with a demo of Jeeves and take advantage of our Tank Talks special with a $250 sign-up bonus and skip the waitlist that already has thousands of companies waiting on it by visiting tryjeeves.com/Tank Talks. Use referral code Tank Talks to get set up today. Now let's jump into the tank for this week's episode with Michelle Delcambre from Felicis Ventures. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Michelle.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
You know, Michelle, I'm so excited to have you here today to discuss the ways in which startups and founders can navigate these challenging times as it relates to attracting and retaining talent. Now, you've spent most, or if not all, your career in the talent space and have held some incredible positions during your time in tech. So to kick things off, I would love it if you can give our audience a brief background on how you got started in the talent world and where you've spent most of your time over the last several years.
I fell into talent recruiting quite by accident. I don't think anyone grows up and says, I hope to be a recruiter someday. But I fell into it by accident when I was still at university. And then when I moved to the Bay Area, I got my first role in tech at Atlassian as the first recruiter for US-based recruiting, and kind of grew my career there. And that was a really good launching point for me, largely because it helped me get my foot in tech, but also really taught me a lot about how strong culture can impact the performance of a company. And from Atlassian, I went on to run either talent or people operations functions for Okta, Databricks, Stripe, Zenefits, and have made kind of a career of joining somewhere between 200 and 400 and helping to scale pretty rapidly to a few thousand, and enjoyed that. And have always loved the idea of building teams and helping companies be successful through the performance and outcomes of those employees. And most recently, I have joined Felicis Ventures as an operating partner, which has really been an interesting role in that I can take my experience and scale that across multiple different companies who I think want to grow to become similar to some of the companies that I've worked for. So that experience has been helpful here.
I mean, that's an incredible background, but I got to ask, you mentioned some of the fastest growing tech companies that you had the benefits of working at in the intersection of talent and culture. During your time at companies like Zenefits, Atlassian, Okta, and Stripe, you must have been exposed to some amazing founders and leaders. So, I got to ask, what was one of the most memorable moments you witnessed a founder or CEO explain on how they viewed talent and its impact on their future success that other emerging founders should know?
I think my answer here is going to be a little indirect. And so I'm not going to point to a specific story here. But when I've been asked versions of this question in the past, I often point to Atlassian here specifically because they stand out to me as a company that had a view on talent from day one. A lot of founders focus on product market fit and early revenue, and those things are critical. I'm not going to argue against that. But those founders often think about talent and culture much later. And I think when Mike and Scott were just two guys in a garage with a credit card, they were thinking about core values and what type of employer they really wanted to be. And I think by prioritizing that early, it led to a lot of the success that Atlassian experienced. And so I think that's the sort of specific lesson there for me. Being intentional about culture very early is important. And I can say I've spoken to many other ex-Atlassians, and they very often tell me that they loved their time there and have struggled to recreate it at other companies. It's a standout for a lot of people in their career. They generated a ton of loyalty and engagement, and that led to high performance and company success. And like I said, I think that really stemmed directly from being intentional about culture early on and has shaped a lot, like I said earlier, of how I think about culture as like a really critical and maybe often overlooked component of company success.
Yeah, it's super interesting to hear you say that. A lot of people do focus on early revenue or product market fit because those are the things that you can kind of touch and feel to see if a company is going to make it, through the death valley where most startups fail. But culture is one of those kind of superficial things that people don't really get to see or touch day to day. And so to hear founders talk about it through their vision and the kind of people they want to surround themselves with, those are a lot of questions we like to get asked or ask founders when they're explaining to us what's so unique about the company that they're looking to build, and not necessarily how you're going to build a product or what kind of integrations you want to build. So I'm really happy you shared that. At Zenefits, though, you also owned recruiting operations that scaled from 300 employees to over 2,000 employees. What important lessons did you learn from your time there that you still rely on today?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are two things I think that really stand out to me in this regard. And if any recruiting leaders I've spoken to in the past are listening to this will sound familiar to them. But the first is that recruiting analytics is as critical as any production recruiter role. And I would argue that it's maybe even more critical. Having good recruiting analytics gives you a ton of insight into how you can be most effective and efficient with your time. And more importantly, I think it really allows you to see ahead. So being close to things like funnel metrics and close rates allows you to really recognize when you might have challenges before you're actually having them. And I mean, for example, like if you have robust metrics, you can see that maybe hiring for sales roles takes 60 days and most candidates drop off after the phone screen. This allows you to potentially change the screen leading up to the phone screens so your so your conversion rates stay tight. It also allows you to make better use of your hiring manager time. I I always say this: leaders are expensive resources and you want to use them effectively. Another thing it allows you to do is say, hey, wait a minute, you need 5 salespeople to hit these revenue targets, and I only have 45 days to fill. That's not going to happen given past metrics. So it allows you to inform the business and be a much stronger partner. And finally, it makes your production recruiters so much more effective. It really helps you to point them in the right direction. So I always tell early stage recruiting leaders to prioritize recruiting ops and recruiting analytics far ahead of when you think you need it. And if you can't get that head approved, sacrifice a production head for it because it will be worth it. And the second thing is this: I think you have to think outside the box to grow fast without blowing your recruiting team size and cost out of the water. And so at Zenefits, for example, we ran these AMA style events with Parker that allowed all these brokers who were very publicly anti-Zenefits to come and tell him directly why they were anti-Zenefits and let him change their mind. And that created a whole pool of talent for us. We ran global hackathons. And I think we were kind of early in the we can get talent from anywhere mentality. As long as we figure out how to be creative about filling the funnel, navigating immigration challenges, being open to where folks can work, it creates a bigger funnel for us. And so those two examples might not work today, but I do think that being creative about how you find and reach talent is really important.
No, those definitely have applications for today. Basically you're saying is turning, recruiting analytics just like sales analytics. It's a funnel, there's win-loss ratios, there's similar attributes that you can have with a sales pipeline and sales analytics as you can have for recruiting. So you should use them together, which is really important. But the other thing I like that you shared about what Parker did, which is he brought the recruiting and HR teams into conversations that may have only been applicable to salespeople on the surface from the partners that they were either competing with or trying to work with. So you can hear the pain points that you're trying to solve. So you can use that in your recruiting process, correct?
Absolutely, for sure. Yep. And I think we did a really great job of growing rapidly and maintaining the culture that we were targeting from early on.
Well, that's amazing. And I can't think of a better way to kick off the discussion today around talent and the wars that founders have been facing around attracting and retaining talent during these uncertain times. So, we've obviously reached a pivotal turning point during the pandemic where we saw so much of the great resignation, along with this rapid change to remote work, leaving many companies scrambling to obviously reverse their traditional hiring processes. So, what did you witness during your time at Stripe from January 2020 until the end of last year that enabled you and your team to manage this transition to remote work and defend against the great resignation?
There are three things that actually come to mind here. And the first one is probably going to sound a little counterintuitive, but the first thing was to pause. And I think that created focus and relative calmness when things were a little uncertain out in the world. Being too reactive to anything often comes back to bite you, and it often eliminates what I think of as optionality. And I think this intentional moment that we took to take a breath, evaluate what we knew to be true, and then what we don't know to be true about tomorrow, and then overlay our company goals with that, kept us from moving incorrectly and then backing ourselves into a corner, and also allowed us to preserve some optionality, which I think was key. The second thing is, I think we were very focused on identifying early which workers might be most impacted, and then working directly with the people in recruiting teams to figure out how we can redeploy them across the organization. And I think we were sort of like, we've hired bright people. We trust our process, both for evaluating and measuring talent to be effective here at Stripe. And we want to make sure we have a home for people wherever we can. And that allowed us to fill gaps elsewhere and ensure that folks stuck around over time, which I think was great. And the third thing is this, Stripe has always been a heavy documentation culture. And when you shift to remote work, that availability of information is a real blessing. And there was so much documented information, such a culture of reading other documents and understanding other teams by sort of lurking in their documents, that we didn't lose a ton of steam and momentum on the knowledge and information sharing and collaboration, which I think was a challenge for a lot of companies who could no longer rely on face-to-face interactions every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the digital transformation for a lot of companies who started at the beginning of 2020 was a heavy, heavy lift. But I always said to a lot of like our investors, I was like, this is perfect for Google. Everything's been documented since day one. They've always had processes going through the digital transformation and the remote work framework, even before it was forced upon them. And obviously Stripe, being one of the absolute leaders and juggernauts in this space, has obviously built themselves that way as well. But tell me what you mean by like kind of analyzing what people were going to be most affected and where you had to shift resources and people around. Give me some like inside baseball on what that actually looked like.
Yeah, so like I'll use a very specific example. When you go from working in office to being fully remote, teams of people who do a lot of things around workplace services, the need for that role and what that role looks like shifts. But a lot of those skills are fully transferable to things like customer success roles, recruiting roles, people roles, other types of admin roles. And so figuring out where there was overlap in skill set, but also understanding that while we could use that skill set, we couldn't necessarily use it in the same traditional way that we'd been using it before, was pretty critical.
And was there anything around like culture or like kind of like team camaraderie that you tried to manage during your time there to bring people together while they were forced apart?
Yes. So Stripe does our annual like team conference called Convergence, where everyone from around the globe converges and comes together. And they shifted that to something called Nonvergence at the time, which was a similar thing, but was done online. And I think they recreated a lot of the expected outcomes of convergence in that facility through different channels and different ways of people engaging and working together. And so I think that went a long way toward maybe accelerating some of the camaraderie that in-office employees might have experienced at Convergence. And I think it's also important to note that I would have described Stripe. I was only at Stripe for maybe a little over a month before COVID, and would say that I would describe it as a very much an in-office culture with a desire to learn a lot from passing people in the hallways and running into people in the stairwell and in the cafeteria. And it was designed around that. But Stripe really focused on recreating those experiences in a remote world in a way that I think was effective.
Well, absolutely. I mean, everyone had to, and I'm sure Stripe did it like one of the best that you could out there. Now, we obviously emerged from this pandemic with the future of work totally being changed as well. Employees' wants and needs were also changing. And so with the addition of remote work, the opportunity for these companies and the talent pools that they can attract has grown exponentially without geographic borders. So how are you seeing recruiters and founders stay on the winning side in the war for talent, given the size of pool that they can now attract?
Yeah, I love this question. And so, look, I think there's this convergence of events happening, right? The first is that the one you called out, which is that we're coming out of the pandemic and the ability to hire anywhere has really increased the talent pool and the talent market. But we're also in this kind of scary and uncertain market in many ways. And this is leading to layoffs that we keep hearing about. And I think this is making candidates both less risk averse in some ways and far more risk averse in other ways. And I think candidates want some certainty in a very uncertain world and also a bit of clarity and balance. And so I share that because I think the big winners for the war on talent are going to do a few things very well. And the first is something that I think really strong companies have already been doing, but that's prioritizing operating rhythms. And what I mean by that is two things. First, Culture Amp published a survey where they analyzed survey responses for, I don't know, 300,000 or 400,000 employees who had chosen to leave their company over the 15 months just before COVID. And one of the most interesting things that came out of that study was that less than half of all of those surveyed employees identified as being happy with their current role relative to what had been described to them. And so when you think about that, that's a lot of unhappy people and suggests that the work really matters and what people are working on really matters. And I think companies with strong operating rhythms and a very clear understanding of how employees can have impact, and those who can tell that story in the interview process will win more talent and retain more talent. And the second thing there is sort of enablement. I think that's really access to the information to do your job well so you can have the right impact without spinning all of these very exhausting and unnecessary cycles. And that goes back to my point about strong operating rhythms. Companies who expect to remain remote or distributed have to get that right, or people are going to become frustrated and move on. And then the next thing I will say here, and I think this is really critical, is that we have to figure out a better way to prioritize talent efficiency as we're laying talent off to save money, but arguably still focusing on growth in the future. We have to get the most out of our existing people, and we can't just do that by making them work more hours and then hoping to keep them. So we have to hold ourselves accountable for being efficient with our talent. And I think like really great companies, right? Like Shopify, as an example, have always believed that you don't have to work 1,000,000 hours a week to be productive. And in believing that, they made it a priority. Their culture is great. The company performance is great. And I think the outliers of this new talent war should lean into that. And then, not to go on forever about this, I think you can tell I'm passionate and interested about this, but I think companies are going to have to be especially thoughtful about compensation, equity, benefits, and their employee value proposition in this world, and how those three things kind of work together to support the whole employee. Because even though we have a larger pool of talent with all of the geographical restrictions going away, we also have a ton of other stuff happening in the world, which is causing companies to be more efficient with capital, but also causing, like I said earlier, candidates to be more thoughtful and risk averse. And so companies need to have a stronger compensation philosophy than before. And they really need to educate their leaders and recruiters on how to tell their story in a compelling way. So I think how recruiters recruit is going to need some fine tuning to support this.
You made a lot of great points. I mean, this is why we have you on the podcast, because you're an expert in your field. But I think like those surveys is what you're saying are kind of misleading, where a lot of people thought there was this huge great resignation because of remote work. But really what you're saying is before even COVID happened, 50% of respondents to the Culture Amp survey were just not satisfied with the work they were doing. They weren't happy in their work environment before they were able to even work home. And that just kind of pushed it over the edge for them to say, hey, I'm not happy. I'm not even allowed to go to the office to see my friends and coworkers. Now is the time for me to really change course and see what else is out there, which is really interesting because a lot of founders and CEOs say we can't get people back to the office. Remote work is what they want, but really maybe it's not what they want. It's other stuff, but this is what their out was, right?
Totally. Yeah. And I think it's also worth noting that Culture Amp ran the same survey again with another 100 to 200,000 employees during COVID and found that the only thing that had really changed in terms of why good employees were choosing to leave was lack of access to the things they needed to do their job well. And so I think what happened then during COVID is that this thing had been happening before, but then during the pandemic, suddenly everybody had been forced to work remotely and didn't know what good looked like, didn't have access to the tools or the technology to do their job very well. And that accelerated something that might have been brewing in the background anyway.
Yeah, I mean, one of our companies was very adamant about being an in-office culture, and they actually saw their recruiting and attrition go up because they were solving really hard problems. They were providing a culture for a lot of people that they found alignment with, and people were tired of like sort of just like being at home all the time and trying to like, find other non-boring projects to work on. Like building a deck in the backyard wasn't exciting enough for them. So they wanted to go back and build some really cool technology, which I totally agree with. But I also think that like HR departments are still struggling on this eternal debate of like, what will our remote work policy be going forward? You mentioned the Shopify example where they moved to the 4-day work week. From my friends who worked at Shopify, they actually said it really wasn't a 4-day work week, but what happened was only meetings were allowed to be scheduled from Monday to Thursday. And then Friday was their day off to just do work by themselves. And so it still was a 5-day work week. It was just there was more structure around how you could work during Monday to Thursday versus Friday on your own. So in terms of like how people are going to think about their policies going forward, what have you seen work besides the Shopify example to adjust to this hybrid work / remote work? And what policies are you recommending founders consider to address these wants?
This is one of those ones where I think it's not a one size fits all type of answer. And I think it really depends on what the founder and the executive leadership team feel they need in place to be most successful in meeting the goals of the business. And so I think in the absence of really having a one size fits all answer, I think it's important to understand that if you choose to be a company that is distributed and has a remote workforce, then that changes a little bit of how you have to operate on certain things. And I'm going to sort of give a roundabout answer here. When my son was younger, probably around 7, he asked me how my day was. And I can't remember exactly what I said about my day, but I shared with him that I'd gotten some constructive feedback. And then I stopped because he's only 7 and said, "Do you know what constructive feedback is?" And I remember this vividly, and I even wrote it down because he said, "Yeah, it's like construction. It means to build something up and make it sturdy." And I loved the way he said that. And my husband works in construction, so I like these sort of construction analogies and tend to stick with them. And I share this because I think of this problem less in terms of policies that we advise people on and more this way, which is company success is really determined by the sum output of its employees. And in order to have maximum impact, employees need to be the right people working on the right things at the right time, and they need to be engaged and fulfilled doing that work. And at its core, I don't think that's really changed. But what has changed is how companies need to enable those things. So whether you're deciding to be in office or out of office, I do think that there are 2 things that you have to do well, especially if you choose to be a distributed workforce. The first is onboarding that quickly create shared experiences and ingest your new employees into your culture in a healthy way. And I think of this as sort of back to my sort of construction analogy around scaffolding. I think onboarding that quickly creates shared experiences and ingests your new employees into your culture in a healthy way is important. Bringing smart people from a ton of different corporate backgrounds together and then getting them to lean into a new way of working and to focus on the right priorities has always been a challenge. And in a remote world, I think it's even harder. So when you don't show people what your ways of working are and then hold them accountable for working that way, or it's unclear, people are humans, right? They rely on what they know. And as you can imagine, a bunch of new hires all relying on different ways of working and prioritizing different goals, both dilutes and negatively impacts your culture, but also slows your performance, right? And so I think an intentional onboarding program is part of the scaffolding that you need. And the third thing I will say is that for a remote world to work, companies have to scale effectively through their leaders. And I say this because I think it was hard for founders to reach every employee effectively when we were in office. And it's even harder now. So having a really well-aligned group of leaders who can lead the right way to reach the outcomes and build the culture that you want is pretty critical to success in a remote world. And I think the leadership layer is really going to become the secret sauce here.
I absolutely love that. I love the analogy to construction. And I mean, kudos to you and your husband for raising such an intelligent 7-year-old to think about the correlation between, building a company or building up a person, just like building a house. People say relationships are like, building a house. You have to have the foundation, then you have to have the 4 walls, and the infrastructure and the utilities, and then the roof to withstand storms. And companies are the exact same way. And so if you haven't built it up from the beginning, like you're saying, you're going to have a lot of faulty things come down in the house. And I think also one of the biggest concerns that we as investors have is that the in-office interactions are particularly beneficial to the younger employees who have never experienced an in-office culture by providing those spontaneous mentorship opportunities that would otherwise occur, obviously, in office. So we're quite worried about it as investors for the next generation of employees who haven't had a lot of those water cooler conversations. So how should CEOs think about that concern, and how should it be addressed for those younger employees who might be missing out on those meaningful conversations to build the scaffolding and the framework around, mentorship conversations?
Yeah, this is a really hard one, and something I've been struggling with, honestly. And so I don't have a great answer, but what I will say is this: if the goal here is really mentorship and development, to my earlier point about scaling through leaders, hiring strong leaders and creating true alignment within your leadership team is important here. And I think some sort of accountability from your leaders or a performance measurement of your leaders that they are in fact doing that is really important. And something else I think I want to say here, which is maybe contrarian, but spontaneous mentorship is great, but it's also a little bit lazy, right? Like part of being a leader is leading, and that means leading the next generation of workers to perform well and advance in their careers. And I know this wasn't your exact point, but if leaders are relying on spontaneous mentorship, it's possible that they've been missing something, and maybe this is an opportunity to create more focus. And then secondly, to sort of keep on this contrarian viewpoint and back to something you said earlier, remote work is hard, and it's harder in a lot of ways. And there are companies out there who probably believe they can't recreate some of these experiences in a meaningful way in a remote world. And there's always the option to send folks back to the office. We have companies in our portfolio doing this too. And it's early to tell right now, but I'm actually really curious to see how engagement and performance stack up for those companies who are going back into the office versus companies who do an exceptional job of enabling a remote workforce. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like spontaneous mentorship is like, it's nice, but it seems like it's almost like an afterthought. Whereas like structured mentorship should be a part of the leadership team's like OKRs. And you should be really held accountable for the mentorship structure you're putting in place, because it's something that like, yeah, the younger generation needs. And it can't just be, in a passing by conversation. It should happen on continuous, like, 360 reviews and all these sort of, employee NPS scores and things like that. I totally agree with that. Now, just changing up a bit, how have you seen diversity and inclusion become a top of mind concern for many companies? And sort of what actions are you seeing being taken to attract and retain talent when it comes to this?
Yeah, I like this question a lot because I think when I started my career, the focus on diversity and inclusion was sort of peripheral, kind of like a nice to have. And companies delayed a focus on it. And then it became a core responsibility of the recruiting team to generate diverse pipelines and hire diverse candidates. And it always felt like that was a very backwards approach and really a recipe for failure. And then taking it one step further, it always felt a little challenging for me as a recruiting leader to be responsible for generating diversity when far more senior people than myself hadn't laid a sturdy foundation for me to build upon. And so now I coach founders to focus on diversity, especially at the leadership level much earlier, and also think a lot more about board diversity, getting more women and people of color on the cap table, because I think this focus on bringing more perspectives into the room from day one and giving people a seat at the table where decisions are being made, I think is really the most impactful thing a startup can do to shape diversity. And I'm seeing more and more of this from early stage founders.
So are you saying like founders who may have just had like all white male founders are now being, coached basically to say, hey, let's think about like, I know we can't change the founding team, but let's think about the board. Let's think about the investor group. Let's think of the advisor pool. Like there are, places that you have choices. Let's expand the aperture here to make sure that we can make some difference and take in multiple opinions rather than just sticking with what we surround ourselves with every day.
Absolutely. And while I think I'm definitely coaching people on this, I'm finding that there's not a ton of pushback. A lot of early founders are leaning into this on their own already. And I think people are recognizing after years and years of research and conversations that more diverse viewpoints actually lead to better outcomes. And so we're just being more creative and more open-minded about how we do that early on.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing the same thing in our RippleX fellowship program where, it's, more than 50% female participants, 70% BIPOC, like really great diversity numbers. And the results are fantastic because we're seeing such, amazing opportunities coming out of it with so many different people from different walks of life. So I'm already seeing it in our own network effect as well, which is great. When it comes to technology resources for HR and ops teams, what do you recommend teams consider when trying to create the most efficient hiring processes to free up resources and time for hiring teams? You mentioned, resource analytics, or recruiting analytics at the beginning. Talk to us about some of the things you recommend people, take hold of.
This is an easy one for me. The headcount planning process is messy at so many companies. And when I joined Stripe, one of my biggest initiatives was getting all of our disparate people and recruiting and finance systems to speak to each other in a way that made headcount planning easier so that the recruiting and people teams could be more efficient, and so that we could avoid all the crazy budget variance from over or under hiring, right? And so I hear this particular problem from a lot of companies. And when you're sub 50 employees, you can track all of this stuff and make decisions on the fly. But as you scale, it's a nightmare to be reconciling these things manually. And also you run into this sort of game of hot potato with who actually owns the headcount plan. And so my advice here is really to sort of build this muscle early. People, finance, recruiting all have really different goals with the data that they need here, but the headcount planning data is critical to all of their efficiency. And so learning to work closely together, thinking of each of those teams as critical limbs in your operating body, I think is important. And then also figuring out some sort of a central tool that you can either integrate with or work together from. We built something in Google Data Studio and Looker, but there are tons of low or no code options to make headcount planning work more effectively that I think companies should start to lean into a little earlier.
Was there anything proprietary at like Stripe or some of the larger companies that you saw that isn't available that you would recommend teams consider, managing themselves, or everything now is off the shelf?
There's a lot of stuff off the shelf, and honestly, it's a lot more cost effective to go that route. We built a full in-house integration, bidirectional integration between Workday, Anaplan, and Greenhouse that then fed into a Google Data Studio dashboard where we could make changes there that would feed back to sort of an approval system for all of our tools. But I think it's much more cost effective, especially for smaller companies, to think about these sort of off-the-shelf, low, no-code options.
That makes sense. Going back to kind of first-time founders and trying to support them, how would you describe the competitive advantage of a strategic talent pipeline to first-time founders who are still unfamiliar with how this is developed and how to build a proper talent pipeline?
Look, there are a lot of people who don't like this comparison between sales and recruiting for various reasons, but I think it's a really good analogy for founders, right? Most founders understand revenue and sales, and they value that. And there's no founder out there who would run their sales function with a hope and a prayer. So a good sales leader always has a strategy to keep the top of the funnel full, keep CAC low, right? Usually that's with BDRs and SDRs and some combination of marketing and branding and all of those things. And I think a strategic talent pipeline is very similar in a lot of ways, right? It allows you to very efficiently manage CAC and conversions and LTV and engagement and CSAT and all of those things for your people from day one. But it means that you have to think of recruiting similarly to sales in many ways. And you need to have the right team and the right mechanics to create top of funnel, tell the right true stories, and convert talent in a measurable and predictable way. And that requires as you call it, a strategic talent pipeline, which is basically very similarly to a strategic sales pipeline.
So basically, don't try to fight the elephant in the room, which is sales, recruiting. It's basically the same thing. Instead of trying to make sales of a product or service, you're trying to recruit someone to come and join your mission.
Yeah, look, if you've known me a long time, you've heard me say this. Recruiting in many ways is sales just with a crappy budget, but a lot of the functionality is the same, right? It's just budgeted very differently.
So you have to be more efficient then. It's even harder than sales.
Exactly. Okay. It's much harder than sales, yes. And also, right, your unit is humans. And if there's one thing you can't control, it's humans.
Absolutely. One of the biggest lessons of the current job market is that sloppy hiring processes can leave a lasting impression on everyone involved in the process. So, what are some common mistakes that you're seeing hiring managers do that should almost always be avoided?
The first one is overselling or being completely unreasonable with equity value. And I think this happens a lot. I actually very recently had a candidate comparing offers from one of our portfolio companies and another company, and she shared the equity one pager and the public company comps were Microsoft and Salesforce. Like, if we become the next Microsoft or Salesforce, your equity will be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And while I appreciate the belief in their mission and sort of this forward-focused outlook. This was like a Series A enterprise SaaS company in a highly crowded space with two clear leaders out ahead of it. And so Microsoft and Salesforce were probably not the right public comps, right? And it felt a little misleading, but this isn't uncommon. I see this a lot when hiring managers, especially, are talking about the future upside of the equity. And so that's something that I think is unfair to candidates. And the second is this, like, just show up, be on time, don't reschedule. It's really sloppy and a little bit disrespectful. And on the flip side of that, I will say this: a tight funnel that ensures managers are spending time with the right folks is the key to helping managers sort of overcome this. And I think recruiters can sometimes overutilize hiring managers' time, and that makes it harder for them to prioritize every interview. And so while I encourage them to show up in a timely fashion for interviews, I also think it's incumbent upon recruiters to be thoughtful about how they're leveraging their time.
Yeah, I mean, a bad process can really ruin the reputation of all the good work that's been done by a company because of one bad interview and someone's Glassdoor review. There's always going to be negatives when someone doesn't get the job. But if the process is sloppy and it happens over and over again, it may actually hurt the company long term from attracting the best talent later on. It's funny you mentioned the comparing of the offers. We're both on the board as observers for VoiceFlow. And I had to do a presentation to the entire company on valuations of stock options and equity compensation plans and all these different things that some of the employees weren't really familiar with. And I was so happy that the founders asked me to do that because it made me feel like, hey, they really do care to be transparent and level set with all their employees about how these things really work, and not just say, yeah, if we're the next Microsoft, you could be, retired and living on an island in a couple of years. So it's really important for founders to utilize the resources of investors like ourselves and Felicis to help employees understand what it really means when you look at different offer packages. As it gets easier and easier, though, for individuals to find a lot of their new jobs, there's a lot of pressure on hiring managers out there. Companies are obviously realizing that their potentially unfair hiring practices or just sloppy, interviewing processes and ghosting candidates is going to come and bite them in the ass. So what advice do you give founders on how to make sure, candidates are moving through the pipeline while juggling multiple job offers, as you mentioned with one of Felicis's portcos, but not rushing the process to let the weaker candidates through the funnel?
My advice on this is pretty straightforward and direct, and it's this. Founders often want to compare candidates against other candidates, but there is only one person for every role. And meaning, well, there are probably a lot of people out there who can do the role. You're probably only going to hire one of them, right? And I think founders often get stuck figuring out what they want on the fly as they are evaluating candidates, and that keeps them from pulling the trigger. And so building a thoughtful evaluation process from the very, very beginning to identify who you want, what success in the role is going to look like, how they need to behave to drive your culture forward. All of those things are going to give a founder way more confidence to pull the trigger when they find someone. But it requires you to trust your process. And so a recruiting leader, and if you don't have one, someone like me, the talent partner at your VC firm, can help guide you on how to do this. Because look, sometimes, especially with first-time founders, they may not know exactly what they need or when they've outgrown someone, or they feel loyalty to an underperforming early leader, and a talent partner can really help them sort of thought partner on what the right profile is for whatever phase of scale you're tackling. And I think that helps to create confidence that you know what you're looking for, you know how to find it, and when you find it, you can pull the trigger on it. And I spend a lot of time with early founders on this. And finally, look, I say this to founders all the time, especially earlier first-time founders. You will make a bad hire. You will. It is going to happen. You can do everything right and still miss occasionally. And sometimes just normalizing that gives founders a little more comfort to move forward when they find someone.
That's such great advice, because there is so much, comparison analysis and subjectivity and a lot of emotions that go into, first time, I got to make this hire. They've got so many other offers, or this person is way better than this other person, but there's no process for how to repeat that. And I love what you're saying is like, take the emotions out, take the subjectivity out, develop a process, iterate on it. You're going to get it wrong for sure, but make sure you keep looking back on trying to make it better, and having people like you as their VC operating partner can obviously make it a much better process. So leverage those resources if you're lucky to have them around you, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So talk to us about your role at Felicis. You're an operating partner and a talent advisor. So explain how you help startups and scale-ups manage their talent processes, and a little bit about Felicis for other people who may not know who they are.
Yeah. So I said this before. My background is in leading talent and people. And I have had the really good fortune to have done that for some great companies that are objectively successful companies. And so I think that repeated experience gives me unique insight into what our portfolios hope to become. And so I leverage a lot of that experience to really help drive better outcomes for our companies by helping them to think about building scalable foundations, helping them build the right employee value proposition, how to get the most out of their employees. And so my role is really focused on that. And I really think of it as helping our companies drive better outcomes through the people who work there, all with a goal really of sort of helping our companies build the right foundations to be the next batch of outliers. And so a little bit about Felicis.
A lot of outliers at Felicis.
Felicis has had, we've been very, very successful, and we have a ton of really interesting and thoughtful general partners and have invested in some great companies. But I think the thing that helps us is that we back founders. I mean, we definitely back companies, but we back founders especially, and then we invest directly in their growth to make them unbreakable. And I think that helps us to stand out. We invest directly back into founder development. The path to being a founder is not a direct one, and it can probably be a little bit lonely. And so our goal is to make sure that we are not just putting money into companies, but also really enabling and investing in the founders as well.
Absolutely. And we've seen it firsthand with your pledge to founders, like the founders of VoiceFlow, on how you really do give back and offer them a lot of monetary and all their additional support as well, which is fantastic. Now, before we wrap things up, we always like to ask our guests for their fast favorites. So first off, your favorite podcast.
I don't think I have a favorite, but I'm currently listening to the Trojan Horse Affair and Things You're Wrong About, and would recommend both of them.
I've never heard that one. I got to check that out. Favorite newsletter or blog?
I like The Tedium by Ernie Smith. He's kind of this web culture archaeologist, and he brings up all of these really random stories that might otherwise disappear into the ether. So I like that.
Oh, that's like the Twitter account This Week in Tech, where it's like they surface like letters that were sent to, executives like Gates, Apple, newsletter or internal letters that were exposed during some like lawsuit or something. I love those. Favorite tech gadget?
Not the greatest answer here, but Apple Watch, not for me, but because it's allowed me to reach my 10-year-old son when I need to without having to give him a phone well ahead of when he needs one.
Oh, fantastic. Favorite new trend?
I don't know if you saw it, but Pinterest just released its biggest trends of 2022. And this concept of tiny library rooms is one of them. I love books. I love the idea of library rooms for all, especially when ebooks are everywhere. So that's one that sticks out to me.
Well, that one hits home because my wife just released her first book, a children's book called Get Outside, to help kids learn about the outdoors and get outside. And we've actually started seeing a lot of people saying, hey, this has now made me want to get more books like this for our kids and create a little library room in the house, which is really cool. Favorite book?
All-time favorite is To Kill a Mockingbird, and I'm currently working my way through The Changing World Order by Ray Dalio. Great read. Definitely recommend it.
That's funny. To Kill a Mockingbird is sitting on our 11-month-old's daughter's nightstand. My wife reads it to her. I don't know why, but it is pretty cute that is one of the books they read to her. And last but not least, favorite life lesson.
Yeah. So my dad's mom once told me that all people have more in common than you think, and it's really important to look for the commonalities. It always stuck with me, but I think it's especially relevant right now when the world feels so individualistic and in such turmoil.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very wise words. And thank you so much for joining us in the tank today with Michelle Delcambre from Felicis Ventures on discussing navigating the current talent wars.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Tank Talks. To learn more about this episode, be sure to go to Apple Podcast or Spotify to find more detailed notes on this episode or to check out previous episodes. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and a rating as it helps us out a lot. And hit that subscribe button so you can get notified when new episodes come out. Finally, make sure to give me a follow on Twitter @MattyBCohen or @Tank Talk Podcast to stay up to date on new episodes or to be a guest on our show. Till next time,